Well, greetings and welcome to Writers on Writing. I'm your host, Dr. Brenda Greene. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the Center for Black Literature and also a professor here of Medgar Evers College. I teach English and I direct the National Black Writers Conference. I want to thank Medgar Evers College. Medgar Evers College is paying for this radio broadcast. Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. You also have an opportunity to watch them via the Center for Black Literature YouTube page, which is www.center4BlackLiterature.org. So I'm very, very pleased to have with me today someone who has been interviewed before, Danielle Evans. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me back.
Okay, and thank you for joining us. So just to share with our listening audience some information about Danielle, Danielle Evans is the author of the story collections, The Office of Historical Corrections, which we'll be discussing today. And Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self. Her first collection won the Pan American Robert B. Binkingham Prize, the Hurston Wright Award for Fiction, the Patterson Award for Fiction, and her second was a finalist for the Aspen Prize, the Story Prize, and the LA Times Book Prize for Fiction. She is the 2021 winner of the New Literary Project Joyce Carol Oates Prize, a 2020 National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, and a 2011 National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. Her stories have appeared in many magazines, which include the Paris Review, A Public Space, American Short Fiction, Callaloo, the Sewanee Review, and Phoebe. And they've been anthologized in the Best American Short Stories in 2008, 2010, 2017, and 2018, and in New Stories from the South. So you have done much in your life here on this planet.
I've tried. I've done my best.
Yes, yeah, it's very exciting. And you are representing that genre of writers. I was talking to my colleague. There's a new group of writers who are doing different things with the genres and coming up with different themes. Your books really focus on exploring the interior life of Black women, and you cover many themes, which include depression, sexual abuse, love, race relationships. And one of the things I really liked about your stories is how you really situate your stories so that readers can really connect to the characters. And of course, my favorite is the Office of Historical Corrections. So we're not going to begin there. I just want to begin by asking you to just give our listening audience a brief overview of this anthology of six short stories. Is six or five? Five short stories.
6 stories and a novella, yeah.
And a novella.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the interesting thing about working on a collection is that usually for a long time, you're just working on individual stories. And so it takes a while to know what the actual book is about. So I think by the time I knew what the book was about as a book, it was just about done. And I realized that what I was writing about over and over again in different ways, sometimes more direct and sometimes more indirect, was a question of kind of who a story belongs to and what happens if we think differently about who the protagonist of the story is or who the center of the story is. And so in various ways, I think the stories are about rethinking personal history, family history, and national history in terms of how did I learn this story? How did I internalize it? What parts of it did I take with me? And what happens if I look at it again? Or what happens if I change the vantage point from which this very familiar story is told? And so some of the stories in the book take that question quite literally, and others are sort of much more personal, but I think they're all about how we live with the past and how we live with what we inherit.
Right, and you know, it's interesting you said personal history, family history, the cultural history, which really is very important to you. And why is that so important to you at this age and looking at where we are in this state of race relationships and the way we're looking at politics and the crime and brutality, the environment. Why was it important to tell this story about history?
Well, I mean, I think I probably have about 3 different answers for that, so I'll try to get them to you as quickly as I can. I mean, I think one is what I'm always writing about as a writer is the gap between who we think we are and who we are, or who we want to be and who we are, right? I think that the engine of a story for me is always in that difference between what we say and what we think, or what we want and what we do, because that's where tension and possibility come into a story, right? That's what makes it possible for things to transform or change. The idea that somebody is holding back something, and so at any moment it could change. They could stop holding it back, and the story could go in a different direction. And I think that history is another version of that for me. It's a kind of larger structural version of that same conversation that we have between our inner lives and our outer lives. What is the story we tell ourselves about this country? What is the story we tell ourselves about our family? And what happens if we have to look at the real story? What happens if we have to sort of admit the parts of that that are fictions, or that we were lied to about? Where is the tension or confrontation or possibility in that? So partly just as a question of kind of story and complexity, I'm interested in those moments where the gaps in our knowledge, or the difference between what we said about ourselves and what's true, matter in some profound way. I mean, I was writing this book for 10 years, on and off. I was doing other things, of course, but I would come back to the stories and think about what questions I wanted to stick with. So there were things in the collection that ended up being unintentionally topical. I was writing the story. I'm from Virginia. I wrote about kind of Confederate imagery in my first collection. I wrote about it again in this collection, but I would come back to the story every couple of years, and something else would have happened, right? And so it would seem like it was responsive to the news. And I had to ask myself a question of kind of what part of this might change in the next 10 years, and what part of this question is a kind of constant question about who we center in our memory of things. And I also think that I was writing this book during 10 years that both on a personal level, I lost my mother. I had to sort of deal with some personal grief, and also I think that there were moments of national grief in the last decade, not sort of the first or most profound even moments of national grief that Black people have experienced, that the country has experienced, but some definite moments of grieving for a sense of lost possibility. And I think that there's always a tension of how to be an artist in those moments, right? Because to sit down and write anything, you have to have some level of belief in the future. You have to, for doing the kind of long-term, slow work of writing something book length, have to believe that someone's going to be there to read it, and that art's going to matter in whatever future we're going into. And so that's harder to do at moments when you feel kind of like the question or the stakes of the question have become about survival. And so I think in those moments, it can be useful to go back to history, to go back to every other moment that people thought we wouldn't live through, and think about, both grieving what was actually lost there, because for every moment people say, well, we survived this, some people didn't, right? And so to kind of go back and both acknowledge those losses, and also acknowledge that there is something to be said for imagining a future in the moments when you can sort of least imagine that there's going to be a future in which our storytelling matters. And so I think that history was really important to me as a writer in this moment, to go back to, both as a way of kind of correcting the record, as kind of pushing back on increasingly false public narratives, but also as a way of just reminding myself in what way stories are part of the record of how we survived and also what we lost.
How we need to take care of what's coming, not what we imagine, not having those disconnects. And of course, boys go to Jupiter is something that's been talked about a lot, and it's really has a lot of controversy. You want to just give us the highlights about regarding that story?
Yeah, so that story it starts with a college student who is photographed by someone else on social media wearing a Confederate flag bikini. And at first she doesn't actually care that much. It wasn't something she bought. She just didn't think about it. But when she's given the chance to sort of to respond in a way that acknowledges that, it's kind of offensive, instead she kind of doubles down. She becomes part of this sort of conversation first on her campus and then beyond that. And kind of at every moment when she might learn something or hear something from somebody, goes the other direction. And so there's something, I mean, part of what I was doing that story is, it takes place in 2 timelines, but it's all in the present tense. And I was interested in that partly because it's another story about grief. Like, part of her excuse for herself is that she's grieving these sort of 2 losses, and has never kind of grown up past that, having to learn better or do better because of some real trauma, but also because of some real privilege, right? Which is the other way that she's sort of frozen in grief, that people have given her all of these second chances, and it's not entirely clear what she's learned from that. And so as the story progresses, what's interesting to me is that I think that people sometimes read the story assuming that there will be a moment of growth or change, or a moment when she gets it because she's a central character. And then you get to the end, and instead of the story being about her transformation, it's about what her lack of transformation means for other people around her. And so I wanted to play with our expectations of story with this kind of what would seem like a familiar redemption narrative. What happens when it doesn't become a redemption narrative, when a person won't redeem.
Right, and that's that's what Roxane Gay meant when she talked about, that you get surprises at the end. And I just thought it was just fascinating. The title of the book, The Office of Historical Corrections, and really a critique and observation of what's going on in our culture, and then coming up with a way to address that. You just touch on so many themes for that in that novella. Let's just say novella. And you center Black women, 2 Black women in that story. What was the motivation, the genesis for that particular novella?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm going to give you the retroactive answer, and then maybe the sort of answer in progress, because I think sometimes you don't know exactly what you were doing something until you're done. And once I was done, or half done, when I was close enough to that story to finish revising it, I think I realized I'm interested in a couple of things there. One is the relationship between these 2 women at the center of the book. In that I think they both undergo transformations, and neither one quite works, right? They're both trying to figure out how you can be a Black woman and exercise some degree of power in a world that structurally kind of doesn't really want you to have that power. And so they kind of switch roles. It starts out with one of them being more kind of conciliatory and invested in respectability politics, and the other person being kind of more outside of the system, or not willing to play along. And as they grow up, they find various ways in which those roles aren't working, and kind of one of them ends up working more outside of the system, and one of them ends up kind of becoming a part of it. And it's still unsatisfying, right? There's no kind of right way to succeed in a structure that doesn't quite want you to make meaningful transformation, right? Because they're both people who do deeply care about the world around them. And these sort of different approaches they have at various times, they're kind of frenemies throughout the story, because it causes tension between them, because they're often in these roles where they're the only 2 Black women. And so because there aren't a lot of other people to compare them to, whatever one person is doing, the other person must be doing it wrong, right? That one of them has to become an example, and the other one has to become like the sort of negative comparison. And so that's how they're used to being viewed or treated in these sorts of various professional and educational situations. And they're never quite able to overcome that, even though they can kind of see it happening. And so I was interested in that dynamic, which I think is the dynamic of like a lot of people in institutions who sort of want to do good within institutions, but are also subject to all of these external forces and requirements. I'm also interested in the kind of larger question of power. I'm from DC. I was raised by government employees. I grew up in a place where a lot of people worked for the federal government, and then I left DC. And the way that people talked about the federal government was kind of startling to me, in a way that it felt so far away, when I was like, no, this is just people's job, right? That I was used to kind of civil servants being people who were making these kinds of choices about institutions and power all the time, in ways that were sometimes second nature, or everyday questions, and sometimes were really fraught ethical questions for them. I was interested in, you know, we were talking about this a lot this week with Colin Powell's death, that, you know, what it means for one of the paths to stability for Black Americans to be becoming in some way the face of government or empire, because there were sort of historical reasons for that, like in terms of paths that were open to people. And so there is a tremendous kind of actual material benefit to that, and a kind of politics of representation around that. But it also means that sometimes people become the face of, you know, empire, or the face of decisions that other people pay for. And so in that way, I was interested in that personal question between these two women also becoming a version of this kind of larger national question of what would it mean to have like good government? What would it mean to imagine a government that actually worked for people? And also in this structure, if you're a person who imagines that's what you're in government for, which I think a lot of people do, what do you do with those moments when you're asked to kind of compromise the ethics that brought you to work for the public good? What do you do with those moments when, you know, your path to thinking you might have the power to transform something or change something or be a representative requires you to possibly do some harm, or asks you to possibly do some harm? And so I was interested in thinking through those questions in a way that sort of wasn't literally it's set in a near future, because I was less interested in trying to play out like a literal living person's life and more interested in kind of what we do thematically with those kinds of choices.
Right. Yes, you do bring in the speculative fiction. So just to go pivot a little, what is your writing process when you sit down to write short stories or even the novella? What is your process like?
Yeah, I think it's different for every story. I mean, one of the things I like about a short story is that you don't necessarily, or I at least, I'm sure somebody does, but I don't always know what I'm writing until I get to the end of a first draft. So I usually try to get the first draft done as quickly as possible. And sometimes that's very quickly. Sometimes I can get a very messy first draft done in a day. Sometimes it takes me a year. Sometimes I keep starting and stopping and say, like, I see these characters, I can hear them. I know the world of the story, but I don't know where the center of the story is. And so I just get to a point where I feel stuck, or I have to back up and delete some pages because I've sort of wandered off into a tangent and I'm too far from there being a through line.
So go a little bit deeper about that process. What do you do when you sit down? Or are you writing every day? Do you just wait for inspiration? What is that? What are your writing habits like?
Yeah, no, I'm never gonna be a writing every day kind of writer. Okay. I mean, more respect to those people. And I think, you know, everyone's process is different. So what works for people, but I just don't have a schedule where I do anything every day, right? I don't have those kind of hours. And I think that the trade-off for that is I try to write when the inspiration is there. So when I feel very strongly like I have an idea, I have to find a way to make the time for that in the middle of whatever else is going on. And I do think that, you know, that there's something to be said for giving yourself some space that belongs to your writing, even if you don't necessarily write on that day. Sometimes I set aside a reading day where I either read what I'm working on, or I read something I've been meaning to get to, just to remember that, you know, as other things that put more concrete demands on my time come in, that this is also still something valid that I need to do, because otherwise everybody will kind of fill up every second of your free time with things that have more concrete deadlines. And so because there is no deadline on your work, sometimes you do have to make them, but I try to be very generous with how I set those deadlines, to just say, okay, here is this week's writing day. And if that turns out to be a reading day, that's fine. If that turns out to be a rereading day, that's fine. But this is a day that I remember that I'm an artist fundamentally, in addition to sort of all the other things that more immediately I'm asked to do. But the longest part of my writing process is always revision. And so that's part of why it's hard to plan for, because once I get that draft done, there are a number of times that I'm going to come back to it and reread it. Usually there's a structural rewrite, and then there's a scene level rewrite, and then there's a sentence level rewrite. And then I might give it to somebody else after all of that and say, I'm done with it. And they might say, no, you're not. And so we might go back. And so sometimes that process is really quick. The first draft comes close to fully cooked. And sometimes that revision process is much longer than the process of having written the story, if it took a long time to get to the draft. Usually the longer it takes me to get a first draft, the closer I am to the end of the revision process when that draft is finished, but not always. Sometimes it's taken me that long to figure out what the story is, and then I have to start over and make it better now that I know what it is.
I would think about writers and conversations with other writers, and you mentioned sometimes you stop and you read. So two questions. Who are the writers who've influenced you? And as a writer, if you had to identify who you're in conversation with, who would that be? Or which
Yeah,
writers would
I
that
mean,
be?
I am really excited about the short story form. And so I think um, Edward P. Jones and Alice Munro are the writers I think of in terms of their influence on not just my work right now, but I think the moment we're in with the short story, where there are all of these people doing fascinating things with time in short stories. I think that the sort of density of a short story and the compression of time is one of the things that always impresses me the most. And they're just both magicians with time. So I feel deeply indebted to them. And I think in conversation with a lot of other writers who also are people like Nafisa Thompson Spires, Jamel Brinkley, Rian Scott, Laura Vandenberg, people who are just doing these sort of, Lauren Groff, people who are doing these sort of very dense short stories that are all really different in terms of their voice and their material, but in terms of their ability to move through the past, present, and future are really impressive to me. And it's also just really exciting to be in a moment, Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, to be reading all of these sort of Black short story writers who are doing wildly different things with the form, but also using the form to its maximum capacity. So I feel very much in conversation. And Dante Moniz, who's my student, I feel like I'm leaving 20 people off, and it's exciting to me that just in the last 5 years, I can name so many writers who've had these sort of really beautiful, complicated story collections. And so that's the conversation that I feel like I'm most immediately part of. I think I am interested in work that thinks about the relationship between the present, past, and future in a sort of complicated way. So my favorite novels are Mrs. Dalloway and Jazz, that I think are both also sort of have that complicated density, have that sense of sort of being in a space and also being haunted by like what that space was and where that space isn't, and what that suggests about what's coming, and that sort of anxiety about the future that nonetheless suggests there's a grace in living through it. So I think those are the kinds of books that I return to as a writer, and hope that I'm influenced by.
So as you talk about the books that are influencing you and the writers, how did you get into writing? What was your childhood life, your childhood like, or your school like? How did you think about becoming a writer?
Yeah, I was an only
motivated you?
child, so I spent a lot of time in my head. And I think that I thought I was gonna be, I always told stories, and I read a lot. And I don't think that I knew that writer was a job. So I think that I never thought that I wouldn't write, but I think I thought that I would do something else because I didn't understand how you paid your rent if you were a writer. And then I went to college and I met people who were writers, or I guess primarily they were professors, but they were also, it was sort of what they did in the world was that they were writers. And I also read more contemporary literature, which was a kind of revelation because I think there's a way that in even well-intentioned educational environments, Black literature can be taught as sociology, right? As though it's sort of doing double duty to teach us history, that we should be learning that history, but we shouldn't be like relying on Zora Neale Hurston to learn the history of the Black South, right? That should be happening in a history class, and we should be able to talk about characters and sentences when we're sort of reading a literary text. Not that it can be entirely divorced, but it shouldn't be the only context we have. I found that when I was teaching African American literature, I would often have to just give a sideline history lecture so the students had enough context to discuss the books, where ideally they would have come to my class with that knowledge and we could have talked about the text. And so I think that I'm saying all to say that having read a lot of books that were taught as a kind of history text more than fiction, it was a revelation to get to college and have professors who talked about craft. So I studied with Manning Marable and Farrah Griffin. And then in fiction, my first couple of fiction teachers were Victor LaValle and Matt Johnson. And suddenly I was sort of able to read all of these writers in a different way, and also introduced to new writers who were doing these sort of really beautiful lyrical things, but also writing about a world that was recognizable to me, both in terms of its voice and in terms of it being the contemporary world. And that I think was the light bulb moment for me, saying, oh, like, I think I could I think I want to do this. So I called my parents in tears because I planned I was going to go get a PhD in anthropology because that seemed to me like where the jobs were. In retrospect, like I never had a good plan, so it's a good thing this worked out. But it seemed more solid, at least, than saying like I'm going to go get an art degree because I didn't even know what you did with that, right? So I called my parents in tears, saying like I don't think I want to go to graduate school for anthropology. I want to be a writer. And they're like, this is why you're crying? We could have told you that like 2 years ago. You called to tell us you're a writer. We know. Leave us alone.
So as we come to a close, what message do you have for our emerging writers and our students? What message would you give to those who want to write or who may even fear doing it? Because how are you going to get a job as a writer?
Yeah, I mean, I think the general advice that everybody gives is still true and good advice, which is to read widely, to read the things that sort of excite you, and figure out what doesn't exist yet that you want to do. I also think, the hardest thing to overcome usually is that first draft, because you have to give yourself permission to write it. You have to say, something, I have something valuable to say, even if I don't quite know what it is yet. And you have to be willing to fail, right? That often the sort of hard part about that first draft is that there are things you're going to get wrong and they're going to bother you, but you have to sort of get through it because it's almost always easier to edit than to generate. Because once you've done it, it can be done. You might not have done it the way you wanted to, but you don't have that voice in your head saying it can't be done anymore because you put the words on the page. You got through the thing that was hard to write. So now you just have to write it better. And so I think what I remind myself is like on your worst day as a writer, you're probably not going to kill anybody. Right? There's jobs where if you have a really bad day, even as a teacher, right, I get nervous. Like if I have a terrible day and somehow I pass it on to somebody else, I could hurt somebody, right? As a writer, if I have a terrible day and I can't get through any of the sentences, I don't have to show it to anybody. I haven't hurt anybody. So I give yourself that grace. Give yourself that grace of the fact that you have the room to fail. You have the room to try risky things. You have the room to get through the part that feels frightening or like you're unsure of it. And once you get to the other end of that, you'll be in a better place than before you started. It's sort of the more time you accumulate saying like, I'm not ready to do this yet, the higher that bar becomes for all those days that you said, well, I have to wait until I'm ready to write this for you to actually write it. Whereas if you just sit down and write through the draft, you can give yourself at least the release of that pressure of thinking it's impossible.
Thank you. Those are excellent messages. And I want to thank you for talking to us on Writers on Writing. You have been listening to Danielle Evans, the author of The Office of Historical Corrections, a Novella and Stories. And this is Dr. Brenda Greene, founder and executive director of the Center for Black Literature. I want to thank Medgar Evers College Radio for paying for this. I want to remind our readers to visit the Center for Black Literature website, where you can also see a YouTube video of Danielle Evans after the show airs on WNYE 91.5 FM. Remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing and empower yourselves as readers and writers. Thank you so much.